Tell us where your interest in the whole classical age really began. You've sort of been doing this all of your adult working life, haven't you?
It goes right the way back to childhood, and I was the kind of child who loved dinosaurs. I liked them because they were big and they were fierce and they were glamorous and they were extinct. And my interest in I suppose, in the Roman army and then by extension the Roman
is of
Empire.
A similar nature.
Well,
yes.
it was a seamless movement from Tyrannosaurus Rex to Caesar. And so the kind of the glamour and the beauty and the power and the cruelty of the Greeks and the Romans I found very appealing. Yeah. And in contrast to that, although I went to Sunday school and I was very, very interested in biblical history as well, I found them all a bit po-faced. Kind of. I didn't like their beards. I preferred kind of the clean-shaven look of Apollo. And so in a way I was kind of seduced by the glamour of Greece and Rome, I suppose. And so the first books I wrote about of history were about Greece and Rome. And in many ways, the appeal particularly I think of Rome is that in certain ways they do seem very like us. So you were talking about Cicero's letters, and this is a man who is worrying about property prices. He's worrying about the weather. He's bitching about
Sounds
people.
Very British to me.
Yeah, so in all kinds of ways he seems very familiar.
Yes.
But the more you live in the minds of the Romans, and I think even more the Greeks, the more alien they come to seem, the more frightening they come to seem. And what becomes most frightening really is a kind of quality of callousness that I think is terrifying because it is completely taken for granted. There's a kind of innocent quality about it. Nobody really questions it.
And what sort of form did that take?
Well, if we're in the age of Cicero, Cicero's great contemporary Caesar is, by some accounts, slaughtering 1 million Gauls and enslaving another 1 million in the cause of boosting his political career. And far from feeling in any way embarrassed about this, he's kind of promoting it. And so when he holds his triumph, people are going through the streets of Rome carrying billboards, boasting about how many people he's killed. And this is a really terrifyingly alien world. And the more you look at it, the more you realize that it is built on systematic exploitation. So the entire economy is founded on slave labor.
Right.
The sexual economy is founded on the absolute right of free Roman males to have sex with anyone that they want, any way that they like. And in almost every way, this is a world that is unspeakably cruel to our way of thinking. And so this worried me more and more, and it was kind of like I was thinking, well, I'm clearly not, as I'd vaguely imagined, the heir of the Greeks and the Romans in any way, really. And so where am I coming from? And it was like a kind of itch, you get on your back and you can't find it. And this was then enhanced for me by then writing a book about late antiquity and the emergence of Islam from the late religious the religious and imperial context of late antiquity, and again finding in Islam a profound quality of the alien. That there were aspects of Islam that were very familiar, but there were many aspects of it that again seemed deeply, deeply alien. And I began to realize that actually, in almost every way, I am Christian. And I began to realize that actually Paul, although in many ways he seems a much less familiar figure than Cicero, the kind of urbane man with his property problems. Paul never had any property; he just made tents.
Yes.
That in almost every what is it, seven? That is the 7 letters that are
people
conventionally people absolutely accept. That and as Tom Wright was saying, this is not a very lengthy amount of writing, but compacted into this very, very small amount of writing was almost everything that explains the modern world.
Well, the Western world, as we take for granted. Yes,
but also the way that the West has then moved on to shape, concepts like international law, for instance. So the fact, concepts of human rights, all these kind of things, ultimately, they don't go back to Greek philosophers. They don't go back to Roman imperialism. They go back to Paul.
Some of the humanists
Paul really
and atheists,
his letters. Letters, I think, are, along with the 4 Gospels, the most influential, the most impactful, the most revolutionary writings that have emerged from the
and
ancient world.
When you penned that article, I think it was for the New Statesman, where you said what I got wrong, and you sort of came out, as it were, and said, as far as my values and background are concerned, I am a Christian.
Yeah.
It was interesting to see the response to that, because I saw lots of atheists and humanists saying, "Oh, hang on, democracy, that goes back to the Greeks. Don't pretend that Christianity gave us everything we're grateful for." But you honestly think that actually people simply haven't appreciated just how much we owe to the Judeo-Christian?
I think. If we're talking of Paul, I think of him as a kind of depth charge, deep beneath the foundations of the classical world, and it's not anything that you particularly notice if you're in Corinth or Alexandria, and then you start feeling this kind of rippling outwards, and by the time you get to the 11th century in Latin Christendom, everything has changed, and you have this. I think essentially what Paul's significance is that he sets up ripple effects of revolution throughout Western history. So the 11th century, with the Papal Revolution, essentially it establishes this idea that society has to be reborn, reconfigured, that vested interests have to be torn down. And then the Reformation, what we call the Reformation, is a further ripple effect of that, and the Enlightenment is a further ripple effect of that. And
very interesting.
It spilled out so much that now in the 21st century we don't even realise where these ripple effects are coming from. We just take them for granted.
I can hear Tom Wright. You want to come in and
just thinking. I haven't actually read from cover to cover, but Stephen Pinker's 2 books where he's saying effectively.
Well, I had him on the show quite recently.
Oh, really?
Yes,
okay.
But
he's saying, forget all that religion stuff. We invented the real world as it should be in the Enlightenment, and all we have to do is apply that more and more rigorously, and just kick that religion stuff into touch. And it's very interesting that some commentators have said, well, if that was going to be the case, it would work in America better than anywhere else. And look at America and what's actually happening, and you'll see that it doesn't. But I think I want to respond with what Pope Benedict said 10 years ago when he was speaking at the United Nations, when he said that the whole idea of human rights is absolutely rooted in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And if you try and get the fruits of that without the roots, all you'll get is the thing will collapse into shrill special interest rhetoric, everyone claiming the status of victim and shouting
when
at
I had
which is
Stephen,
exactly
Stephen,
what we
Well, of
are.
course, but the power of victimhood is again something that is part of the revolutionary inheritance of Christianity.
Yes.
Because that is the point of the crucifixion.
And nobody in Caesar's world would have said, "Oh, I'm a victim, therefore I've got to be prioritised."
So Paul calls it a scandal.
But when I had
absolutely.
Stephen Pinker in the very chair you're
yes.
sitting in right now, Tom Wright, his response to this argument, which at this point was being put by Nick Spencer, who's written a very good book as well on the evolution of the West, making this very argument. His argument was, no, but, okay, Christians may have given us some good principles, but all we need to recognise is our universal humanity, that we're part of the same species, we're all sentient. That gives us every grounding we need for treating each other with dignity and human rights.
And who thought like that in the first century? I mean, Paul talking about Adam and Christ, basically.
So are you saying that kind of a belief doesn't simply emerge from a vacuum in a sense?
Yeah, the idea of a universal humanness is something that actually, even in the 18th century, they struggled with. When missionaries went to America and came back arguing about whether the American Indians had souls or not.
Right.
Were they really the same species as us? And then John Wesley and George Whitefield and so on saying, no, these people have to be taught to love God like any of us. And so there's stuff going on there which is, again, rooted in the Christian
and you're
faith.
part of the pushback on this in a way, aren't you?
It seems to me that the single most influential phrase for understanding why we have a notion of a kind of common humanity is in Galatians, where Paul says, that there is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, neither male nor female, and there you have this idea that we are. Of course, he goes on to say in Christ Jesus, and that for the contemporary world is, we just.
That's the bit people want to do without.
But of course, there is an issue there, as Daniel Boyarin, in a fascinated Jewish scholar writing about Paul, says, so Jewishness and Greekness gets dissolved into this universal humanity. But what if I, as a Jew, want to stay a Jew? And so, in a sense, there also you have the kind of the issues that continue to obsess our society, which is essentially, if you don't want to be part of a kind of universal commonality, what then do you do?
The dangerous thing, I was at a conference in America a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago,